you can imagine these layoffs are going to happen as a way to slough off. Like it's basically a rubber band effect where when you do so much of this constant self-raising, it's eventually going to cut itself off. In extension to last week's topic of displacement of accountability, where you take your responsibility and you put it off to the side, just ignore it. There is an extension to that, which is something that you can see really evidently out in the world, because it has to do more with how a large, broader sense of things is just ignored. Originally, what I'm pointing out here, I was going to talk about negative narratives, basically looking at the negative side of a story, which in popular culture is a big no-no. Popularly, in a positive culture, positive mindset, you ignore any sort of negativity. But honestly, when you do that, when you ignore the negative side of things, there is a large chance you're ignoring the things that need to be taken care of and need to be understood in a vast cycle of things. Because if you're just all one directional positive mindset, you'll end up not really growing or dealing with the things that'll help you grow. And it's one of the biggest challenges when you have a really feverish growth mindset that only thinks of the positive. Because, yes, it's good to think of the positives in order for you to keep going. However, if you don't take care of the foundational, stones, the pillars, the cornerstones of what helps you build something, it's ultimately going to fail. Or even if you try to learn from the failure, you're not looking at it holistically so that you can effectively build something not only efficiently, but also effective in terms of building further things. So when you ignore the negative narrative, we're going to touch on here today on what that is. But the issue with the term negative narrative is that it already exists. That term exists in narrative psychology, and in therapy. I'm going to read you the definition. I'm going to zoom in over to it right now. What is a negative narrative? A negative narrative in therapy and psychology are the bad stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And understandably, we are the biggest critic of our own selves in our lives. And so it's important that we preserve the clarity of this term, in which case I'm not using the term negative narrative anymore. And I'm glad I did the research on this. The term I'm looking to emphasize and promote is ignored narratives, the parts of the story that we're choosing to forget, the B story, the C story, the other stories that we really need to understand if we're going to preserve a greater holistic, responsible story for ourselves in the future. Because I'm a firm believer that because of how we live things in terms of logical sequences, we are a walking, talking, moving story that interweave with other people. And so when we look at ignored stories, I'm going to cover three different topics, three different industries that have an ignored narrative that isn't talked about enough, that isn't emphasized enough. And I feel that everyone should at least be aware on what they should do, not just in their own personal choices, but also be aware of how the consequences, the ignored narratives of these industries are going to affect us in the future. And at the end, I'll also talk about the solutions that we could look at in terms of dealing with ignored narratives. Now, the first industry we're going to talk about is the tech industry, which I'm a part of. And this is a big thing because I lived in San Francisco for a year and I talked to people of various walks of life. And I've seen certain strategies and lifestyles occur in the Bay Area where Silicon Valley is and the San Francisco area is where all the tech companies are. And the lifestyle consequences that comes up from the tech culture there. Now, we have Joanna Macy, who is the lead director at KULR, and we're going to be talking about the mass layoffs that occurred not too long ago for the FANG companies, which include Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google, because they are the big titans of the tech industry. And so many people before were all striving for those positions within those companies in order to gain level of income and clout. Her thoughts on the entire layoff situation is that this is more of a, let's see, what she says here is, I would argue that we're probably, history will show that it is more of a referendum on how these companies were managed and how quickly they grew versus a systemic problem in the tech sector right now. Now, I would disagree with her, and I'm going to explain why. Her position is the fact that this is mismanagement and how they grew, which is, understandable. She's not wrong. That is a factor into it. But it's also a systemic problem in the tech industry. And when I say tech industry, I mean predominantly the Bay Area, because I've seen this tactic on the worker level. I don't know on the executive level, but a typical strategy, and some of you may know this if you work in the tech industry, what they would do is that workers would work a few years in one place, usually up to 2 years at most, and then they would jump to another company within the Bay Area for a higher salary. And you'd imagine this system, this process never changes. So if you can imagine, every 2 years, people from all different companies are applying into each other. It becomes incestuous. And I don't use that term lightly, because I even talked to some of my peers in the industry, because I did work there at one point, so I have a number of friends there, and even people outside of that industry. They agree it is incestuous because everyone's applying within the sector, and all they're doing is just raising their salaries. And ultimately, when you do that, that raises the overhead for the company. And at the same time, you're also creating a socioeconomic situation where things start to rise up in price, because now there's a lot of money coming in from the tech industry. Unfortunately, when I talk to a number of people that I worked with, or not worked with, I lived with, because rent is tough, so you're going to have a number of roommates. A number of them come from middle class to lower class. A number of them are students, and some others are just trying to make it through the day. At one point, I was even starving in the Bay Area, so I need to rely on food bank because of how expensive certain things were. And this was early in my career. Not too early, like maybe mid. But a number of them, middle class and lower class, would all be gunning for the same positions at times that were non-tech related. And you can imagine, with a very dense population in the Bay Area, all vying for the same attention, same business, same level of growth outside of tech, and sometimes in tech, that pressure cooker of a scenario is going to create an output where you will see an increase in mental health issues as much as increase in homeless population. And after I lived in the Bay Area, and I later moved back to LA, and then from LA eventually moved to Vegas, whenever I would visit, come back to California, I was very shocked and surprised to see an increase in the homeless population, increase in poverty in general. And, it is, I would definitely say it was largely influenced by the tech industry, unfortunately, because of the strategy, the very selfish strategies that a lot of my peers would do in the industry, where they're just constantly like feeding off of the system and not really looking at the consequence of what they were doing, because they're just thinking of their own benefit, betterment, which is fair, because a lot of us in really high technical careers are going to look for a better lifestyle, a better way of being able to take care of ourselves and other people, go on adventures, etc. That's fine. That's a dream. But I don't see an easy solution for the socioeconomic fallout that comes from doing these strategies within the tech industry itself. So you can imagine these layoffs are going to happen as a way to slough off. Like, it's basically a rubber band effect, where when you do so much of this constant self-raising, it's eventually going to cut itself off, because the system needs to restore itself, because this is like a snapshot of the larger economy, where yes, you can inflate, but then you're going to have a recession, because there's always a checks and balance. whether by the system itself or the natural effect of how the market fluctuates or how people just evolve with the system. It's eventually going to correct itself one way or another, whether it's going to be a soft correction or a massive cataclysmic correction, like very similar to what's happening with the banks right now. So that's the tech industry in terms of them ignoring the narrative, the story of what they're doing and not doing, and the consequence of it. We're going to switch over to fashion because that was another industry I was a part of. And I'm sure a number of you would know that the fashion industry produces a lot of waste. And if you think of just high-end fashion or expensive fashion being the only contributor to that waste, it's actually also mass-produced fashion. So that's a lot of fashion that, let's say, for instance, everyday wear, stuff that you would get from Target, stuff that we would get from like Walmart, anything to help clothe the masses. I remember one of my bosses a long time ago when I was working in fashion industry told me that the three industries that have long-term viability are real estate, fashion, and food. And you can imagine with that type of approach, fashion affects all of our lives. It's not just the couture fashion. It's not, all the celebrity fashion. It's not just your Macy's and Nordstrom. It's everybody. It affects everybody. All the way down from the cheapest, like a few cents per shirt, all the way up to, your executive wear. So with it affecting all lifestyles and it being mass produced, because that's one of the consequences of ready to wear fashion, there is so much waste that now there are businesses being built on top of the waste. And, the fact that it affects so much of our ecology, like let's say, for instance, here, the 20% global wastewater, you'd imagine, where is this all piling up? Is it just sitting out in the ocean? It's not just sitting out in the ocean where, waste piles are building up. It's also in places where now there is a waste culture, like in Ghana. One of the biggest challenges in Ghana is that they built an industry where they're surviving off of the imported waste, the clothing waste from other countries like the US or Canada. And I remember watching a documentary on this, very fascinating, but also very sad because there's so many people in Ghana and West Africa where they buy huge packages of clothes, used clothes, that are waste, and they try to restore it, they try to wash it, and they resell it. But you can imagine if they're all wasted clothes, not all of those are sellable. So when things are not sold, sometimes it just gets piled up in this landfill. It gets buried with a lot of mud. It starts damaging like ecology where, birds, fish, hold a bunch of different things. And, you end up in a scenario where a lot of the people who sell these reused products are doing so just to make a living, just so that they could feed their family. But after the things that are not sold, they just get piled up. They get burned away. That's the only way they can get rid of it. But there's just so much clothes that burning away all of this trash clothes just doesn't go anywhere. They even mentioned that, thousands of people survive on secondhand clothes, survive to feed their family. So there's not an easy way to resolve this. But we know for a fact that the fashion industry actually loses $500 billion a year due to the waste that's being created. So that's something that is largely being ignored. There are a number of fashion retailers or businesses that are trying to create recyclable clothes, but I don't think it's enough to really cause a significant dent. But they're trying. But again, this is one of those ignored narratives that we should pay attention to. And while we're in the realm of sustainability and recycling, let's talk about recycling in general. So this is a CBS News report from last year. This was something I found very fascinating. where I had this thought that maybe our recycling is pretty strong and makes sense. But then when Greenpeace looked at it, did their report analysis, our recycling is actually very inefficient and it needs a lot of help. So I quote here, titled Circular Claims Fall Flat Again. Study finds that 51 million tons of plastic waste that is generated in households in 2021, only 2.4 million tons were recycled. That is a very small amount that actually got recycled out of the great chunk of majority that isn't recycled. So ultimately, our recycling system in the West has failed. There is an alarm that is raised right now, and people are trying to figure it out. However, it's not enough. And the reason why our recycling has failed so much is various reasons. And one of them that I know for a fact is a thing that everyday life we end up dealing with is recycling products is contaminated. We don't wash our products before we put it in the recycling bin. At least not everyone does. Like let's say, for instance, a Coca-Cola can. We're not going to rinse it out before we put it in recycling. If that thing is full of gunk from like dried out any sort of soda stuff, it's going to be contaminated. It doesn't all burn off as easily, but maybe that's not the best example. Let's say a yogurt cart container, a plastic container, and for some reason it just dries up and all this yogurt stuff is on the inside. You put that in recycling, it's contaminated. It's one of the major reasons why we just don't have our recycling working. And no one really talks about it enough. Had it not been Greenpeace who did this report, it wouldn't have made the headlines. And even then, even if it made the headlines, how many people know that recycling is not working right now? I don't know. I haven't really talked to anyone that knows that. So it's a minority, if anything. And that's the wonderfully horrible thing about the ignored narrative, is that there are so many stories out there that we just don't know about that's going to affect us in the long term, whether it's these large economic issues or socioeconomic issues or social issues, or even our own personal lives when we have this ignored story because we're so enamored with the things that we're more excited about, because we've built a culture where we have to be more excited about the fun stuff, about the cool stuff, and that we always constantly try to work towards the fun, the cool stuff, or try to emphasize the fun and cool stuff because that's what makes us keep going. That's what makes us live better. But we do it so much at this point that we've hit a saturation point that we're ignoring so many things, like what I just mentioned here, that it's created a world where all we do is suppress and find that anything different from what we're more excited about is wrong. The notion, the creation of positivity culture has already created its own issues. And so you wonder, what is our solution for these things? So when I wrote down some notes on ignored narrative, I wanted to look at what are possible solutions. Because, right now, just because it's not viral or trendy, it doesn't mean it's not important. So I would say, if for a solution to address ignored narratives is to look at how popular or necessary trends ignore what it takes to achieve renown and value, or attempted value, right? So what I mean by this is, yes, you can be viral, you can be popular, you can make the next Mr. Beast video, but the consequence of what it takes, what does it take to make the structures, to make that homage to what is that? Squid Game, right? He made so many of these sets. Okay, so what do you do with all these sets? Do you just break it down and throw it in the recycling, which, as I mentioned, just goes into a potential landfill that doesn't get recycled? It just adds to the pile. What do you do to make something very successful? What is the consequence of that? What does it take to gain that glory? And even if it's not successful, okay, well, how many attempts did you take to make that successful? And what is the consequence to make it get that far? In addition to looking at the cost of doing something, also look at how many stages, resources, manpowers it takes to make it happen, which is kind of what I alluded to. And ultimately, when it comes to assessing the resources and consequences, which sounds really boring, but that's a part of the reason why this is a challenge. Once you've assessed all those things, now you got to look at, how do I create change? In a later topic, later video, I could start to formulate how to create effective change, because we're going to go into holiday creation and ritual creation. But for this one, I would say that it is easier to create change for things that are not complex. What I mean by complexity is, if it's just a matter of writing a letter to someone and that will actually guarantee change, very easy. But if it's complex, where there is a specific process that is very nuanced, very specific to something, and it's handed off to someone else who has their own process, and there's this chain of responsibility, a chain of accountability, chain of custody that occurs, then that ultimately becomes more difficult to create long-lasting change. One of the interesting things about very passionate movements, like let's say, for instance, the civil rights movement under Martin Luther King, is that it required a lot of charisma and a lot of talking to a number of people and talking to more people and more, and other people rallying to support this cause because someone charismatic enough has said something in very specific words that enthralled the masses. And yeah, just want to keep it flat straight. Wow, I recorded for 20 minutes. This is a very long video. But this is something that I feel is very important. I don't have all the solutions right now, but I want to point out the importance of recognizing an ignored narrative, and that unless we have a very holistic view of things, any positive, any progressive movement we have going forward is going to have issues. And unless we take care of the entire thing, all we're doing is a rubber band effect. We keep pushing enough towards progress and positivity and stuff, and by ignoring this one thing that was like lagging behind, it's going to slingshot back into it, just like a rubber band that's been tethered to something. So something to keep in mind. Have any other thoughts on this? Share in the comments below. Besides that, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you guys later.